Account Executive for Patheon Incorporated, Letty Kirk.
And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lisa Cohen. She's going to be the panel moderator for Understanding Global Health Market Opportunities, Reaching for the Greater Good Can Help You Go Global. So, thank you.
Okay, Friday, midday. Yes, exactly. We've got a lot to look forward to, and especially actually in the next hour. I'm Lisa Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Global Health Alliance. I have the privilege of working with the leadership and the organizations that make up, I think, the greatest concentration of global health expertise in the world that's here based in Washington State. And I am really delighted to have the participants on the panel today. I am not going to spend time in bios. You've got great biographies in your programs, and I want to get into the discussion. So I want to first introduce, we've got Jennifer Dent, who's the Executive Director of BioVentures for Global Health. We've got Dr. Guy Palmer from Washington State University, who is the founding chair of the Paul G. Allen School for Global Animal Health, and he has a bunch of other titles that we would be here for the next 45 minutes. We have Maurizio Vecchione, who's with Intellectual Ventures, but he runs their Global Good program that you'll hear more about. And we have Jerry Zeldis from Celgene, and they are just doing amazing things. You're going to see how he, from a company perspective, from a corporate perspective, is understanding the opportunities to work in global health. And we have Ed Yu from PwC, and PwC, which some of you may have known as PricewaterhouseCoopers for years, but PwC is working with all across the spectrum with corporate and nonprofit partners to help come up with business opportunities and strategies for working in global health. So I'm delighted to have everybody. Let's welcome the panel, please. So our goal today on this panel is to inspire you to consider investing, taking part, applying your skills to address the problems and challenges in global health. And when we talk about global health, we are talking about the health of those most vulnerable, the most underserved populations in the world. And that can be here in South King County, or it can be somewhere in Tanzania, Zambia, India, Vietnam, can be emerging markets, it can be the BRICS countries, but even more, it's those more underrepresented countries. So there are some unique challenges and very exciting opportunities there. I want to start with you, Jennifer. If you could, why, from your perspective with BVGH, why would you recommend companies consider moving into global health?
Thanks very much, Lisa, and it's a pleasure to be here today. You know, I think companies can't ignore global health because the world's getting flatter and flatter, and when you look at the forecasted growth potential, for instance, in pharmaceuticals in North America and in the big European markets, it's forecasted over the next 10 years to be between 3% and 6% growth. And that's certainly not going to make big pharmaceuticals companies, shareholders happy. The BRICS have been key markets for quite a long time for pharmaceutical companies, but companies are starting to look at middle-income countries, and particularly looking at the African continent as a future market. So there's, I think, a real critical opportunity for companies to start to become involved in global health across Africa so that they can start to understand the opportunities, the cultural differences, the different approaches to doing business, and really starting to build some relationships in those markets. I mean, if you just look at Nigeria, I was actually in Abuja, Nigeria last week, launching a program with their National Universities Commission to build partnerships for universities, between universities and biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies. I mean, Nigeria alone has half the population of the US. And it's an extremely wealthy country. They've just recently recalculated their GDP, and it's twice what South Africa's GDP is. And this is an extremely fast-growing economy, The Milken Institute report reported that the 7 fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent. So I just think you can't ignore global health, and it presents a great opportunity.
Ignore at your profit peril. I want to go next to Jerry. And Celgene is working on a number of diseases that are often considered neglected, and they aren't thought of as having a large market. So you've got Chagas and river blindness, leprosy, HIV, malaria. It's kind of what aren't you working on? But these aren't considered big money makers. So why is Celgene investing?
Yeah, no, well, thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. Well, Celgene, first of all, is not an infectious disease company. We don't have any commercial products which address communicable diseases. But what we do have is an extraordinarily diverse library. And we also have a very good understanding of immune modulation. And we decided in 2009 that we must have a number of therapeutics in there which could help people, even if we don't make money. And therefore we decided we'd plumb our library to see if we could apply it to these neglected diseases of the developing world, knowing quite well, and you said it very nicely in the introduction, Lisa, that what global health is about is going after people with low income settings. It doesn't make a difference where they are in the world, and maybe low middle income settings. So what we did was we took our library and I'll make up some numbers. There are, let's say, 38 chemical clusters from which we've derived 450,000 compounds that modulate or inhibit 26% of the human kinome, and we have ubiquinase ligases and SERMs and other things in there. And we made a plate of 88 compounds, which was representative of these 450,000 compounds. And we sent them out to a variety of institutions, product development programs, to look at malaria, Chagas disease, human African trypanosomiasis, a variety of other diseases. And typically, we'd get a call back saying, well, a couple of compounds were quite toxic. Yes, there were 3 or 4 that did inhibit or kill the bug, but they weren't very impressive. And before they could hang up, we say, okay, we'll send you another plate of backups on those structures. And by doing this iteratively, after about 4 or 5 iterations, we had compounds that in the low nanomolar range were killing the bug or inhibiting the bug in one way or another. And so we have a very active collaboration now with Medicines Malaria Venture. We have 3 classes of compounds that kill Plasmodia, and we expect that we'll have other classes as well as other assays come online. We're working closely with Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, looking at Chagas, human African trypanosomiasis, and now lymphatic filariasis. We have compounds that kill replicating and non-replicating tuberculosis. We have an immune modulator that prevents the necrosis and fibrosis that occurs with tuberculosis and enhances the killing of TB. And we expect, thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we did a study in cyno monkeys in University of Pittsburgh. It's about halfway over. It's not over yet, but it's consistent with what we've seen in other animals, and we anticipate being in human beings sometime next year.
So, Jerry, can I just ask, if you, from your perspective, you were taking compounds that you had developed for other diseases and found that they had application here, correct?
Yes.
And so we shouldn't be disease-specific necessarily, right?
Yeah.
We need to be thinking more cross.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to the person who got thalidomide FDA approved for treating erythema nodosum leprosum, which is a vasculitis associated with lepromatous leprosy, and then we discovered that it had activity in multiple myeloma, and that actually was the commercial birth of Celgene.
Right.
So
that's,
we recognize that if we develop a drug for human African trypanosomiasis, and that disease has a black box warning, you'll never make a return on investment if you go after HAT. This may work in something else for which, in a high income setting, you could make money. And the handshake I have with the leaders of our company, meaning the CEO and the board, is that if we create something that works for something, and there's a way to make money on it. A certain percentage of that revenue will come back to global health, so we can continue to do this. So
That's great.
It's kind of
That's
like a
great.
Muhammad Yunus social business model.
Great, that's terrific, and that's a nice segue to Ed, who really works on developing these business models and advising companies. So when you think about what Jerry was talking about there, and thinking about this global health impact, why is it in the best interests of companies to think about this?
Well, I think it at the end of the day, I think about it like this: for those of us who are, and all of you who are fundamentally changing the science of healthcare in search of cures. The analogy I use is, for those of us who are old enough to know, it's a pinball game. It's iterative, and you got to keep playing. That fundamentally requires two specific things you got to have. You got to have money, and you have to demonstrate results, meaningful results. So now you compare that against the landscape, in the area where I focus a lot on medical technology. Between 2005 and 2012, return on R&D in medical technology industry shrank 10%, and overall growth for medical technology industry shrank 12%. You step back and say, how are we going to fund that pinball game? It's not happening. And I think, frankly, when you look at the landscape of the United States, it's such a rich opportunity in terms of the dysfunction of the healthcare system. We tend to obsess about it. You kind of go, well, it's $2.8 trillion in industry, of which a third of it is waste, according to the Institute of Medicine. That's $1 billion I could play. The problem with how that funding flows is it's caught up between the political arena, the sensibility of the US public, and it's very hard because for what you're doing, the fundamental science, and that is funded by R&D funding, is just not interesting, frankly. Now you step back and you say, well, that can't be the case. I mean, saving the lives of patients is what we're all about. And so what you fundamentally need to do is, how do I connect the dots between the value of a life saved or disease cured to the economic benefits from a shareholder perspective? And that's where I think the opportunity lies. When you look at, then step back and say, you look at somebody like, for those of you who had the opportunity to listen to Sue Siegel at Health Imagination yesterday, you're basically hearing what she's doing. Corporations like that today are uber venture funds. They're called corporate venture funds, and they're not just funding, because what they're trying to do is get access to you. They're trying to get access to the innovation that you fundamentally can generate that they cannot. And you can't play that pinball game very easily inside a corporation like General Electric, but they need it. And so the kinds of things, the models that you can look at today are in the global stage, where large categories of diseases are in fact growing between 15 and 25%. Where there is growth, which is ex-US, there is funding. And where there is funding, there's an opportunity for you to pitch and say, this is what I want to do. I'll give you an example.
Actually, I'm going to come back to you on that. Is that all right? Okay, because I want to get to Maurizio and Guy as well. Guy, from your perspective as an academic researcher who's constantly thinking about funding, what do you look for in a partnership with corporate? What do you look for in a corporate partner?
Well, I think what we start with is looking actually at what the mission of the university, especially a public research university, is, and that's to raise society through scholarship. So that has to be at the bedrock of what we're looking at. Now, how then do we translate that into effective partnerships, public-private partnerships within that overall mission? I think the first thing we look for is curiosity, because that actually underlies the scholarship mission of what we're doing. So we're interested in partners who want to venture into the unknown, find problems that have not been properly defined, or we're not sure where we're looking at in the spectrum of the problem. Are we looking at the proximate cause or the fundamental cause? So we're very interested in private partners that are curiosity driven. I think the second part of that is that they're very outcome focused. We want to know what the outcome metrics are, as most of our private partners do as well. But part of that, because of our fundamental mission, is there's also has to be, as we raise society through scholarship, quite imbued in that partnership has to be a sense of social justice, that we're in fact raising all of the partners that we're serving, including the most vulnerable in terms of the global health space. So I think one of the ways that we actually can do that in looking at those metrics is, and we've partnered effectively, is actually looking at interventions as a research tool, that we ask scholarly, we build into an intervention if we're going to be testing a vaccine or something like that. In a population, we actually use that as a tool for scholarship. So it's an iterative process then to how you either improve uptake of the vaccine, you improve the efficacy of the vaccine, community acceptance, et cetera. But we build that into that. And if we have private partners who want to build into that, it's very effective.
You know, that's interesting because I think what I hear sometimes from corporate folks is that they're worried that working with academics, it's not outcome focused. So I think we just need to break down these stereotypes and assumptions as we're learning each other's culture. So Maurizio, let's talk about the funding model for global health. I mean, you've got a 30,000 foot view of this and all the opportunities here. Why don't you give us an overview?
Certainly. So I guess there are a couple of points I'd like to make in terms of global health funding. It is a very interesting, different market because the very thing that produces the challenge, meaning the dysfunctional governments, the poverty, and all those kind of things, also produces the opportunity. So there is something in global health that really doesn't exist in many other sectors, which is massive donor involvement. And, you know, for those of you that are not directly involved in that, when you look at the community of philanthropic endeavors that are operating in global health to scale, what you need to realize is that most of the budgets that are being spent by the classic stakeholders, whether it'll be multilateral organizations like the WHO or UNICEF, or when you're looking at individual governments in, say, the 70 poorest countries in the world, and the whole induction of ecosystem of supporting organizations that range from the academic world to the corporate world, most of that capital is actually coming from private donors. And so, so that is an opportunity because to some extent, philanthropy presents you with the opportunity to have a second type of venture capital. And it's a venture capital that typically is not looking for a return on investment. So when you go back to that equation and that challenge that people said at the beginning, you know, how do I tell my shareholders that there is a return? Well, there are people that want to actually give you money to do this interesting work, and they want to do it without, in a way that it will actually enhance your shareholder return. And that's not to say that the end game is to get a grant from some foundation. But that is to say that you have a strategy in thinking about how you're going to fund these efforts that includes a stakeholder that normally is not present in biotech or life sciences funding. So you asked a question about global good. Global good is a new effort, relatively new effort that Bill Gates has started. It's a sister organization or a brother to the foundation itself. Intellectual Ventures is the general partner in that effort. So it's a collaboration between Intellectual Ventures and Bill Gates. And our goal is to really channel Gates funding in the area of disruptive technology, specifically aimed at the 75 poorest countries in the world. So you know, for us, it's all about how do we unlock value in corporate partnerships so that a corporate partner can eventually run with these de-risked technologies in a for-profit model. So it's a philanthropy that is supporting for-profit emergence because the ultimate belief is that if you are going to be sustainable in the intervention, you can only do that through market forces. And so we want to help catalyze these market forces to ultimately have classic life sciences funding take over. And that's sort of the contrast and compare with our colleagues at the foundation where they do more classic philanthropy. We do very much corporate partnership type of philanthropy.
So Jennifer, you're nodding as Maurizio's talking about this, and you with BVGH, you are all about creating these partnerships. So what are the challenges that you commonly face, and what do you tell companies about why they should do this, in addition to the statistics you talked about, but how is it going to enhance their ROI?
Well, I agreed with everything that Maurizio is saying. I think that global health and developing products for global health really do present an interesting new opportunity and a new financial model. And I think that model is still evolving from a financial and an investor standpoint, where there could be there is the potential for some really new innovative financing models where we're engaging countries, ministers of health and ministers of finance in these countries to participate in funding some of the programs that address some of the health burdens in their country. Companies, I think to engage companies ultimately want to help patients. They employ a lot of scientists, and I think companies want to make money, but the people that work at companies ultimately want their inventions and their products to reach the patients that need them. So companies have their corporate social responsibility groups, and some of the programs that BVGH develops fit nicely under their corporate responsibility areas. But also, what we find is companies, they don't have a commercial plan to always participate in global health. So if you develop a platform and a program that makes it easier for companies to participate, we've found that they're very willing to do that and very eager to do that, especially if you build a program from the ground up. So you don't necessarily start with a program like Pfizer's investment in building an infectious disease institute in Uganda, which has cost them about $60 million to date. You start with a smaller program and a smaller commitment, but one where you can really measure the impact that it's having in the lower or middle income country, as well as the direct impact that the company is having on global health in that region.
So Ed, do you have an example of how PwC has helped a company do that in the developing world?
Well, some of the things that we are doing for our companies, our clients, are really around getting global access to populations in order to validate their solutions. So take, for example, one of the areas that's really hot right now for those of us that are doing alternative models for doing clinical trials or enabling your medical device to have remote patient monitoring. It's all about the validation of the engagement with the population. It's just very hard to do in the US, whereas we have a client who is partnering their product with Apollo Hospital in India that has a large program in diabetes care using SMS text messaging. And when you think about the opportunity to do that kind of a partnership, it's really amazing how quickly you can get rapid learning and do the kind of iterative design and development to really speed up your time to market. And so, I mean, there's just an evidence that you just cannot get more rapid innovation than if you're smart about the population that you pick to try to validate your technology and learn and do iterative design.
Guy, how do you choose, because you do so much work in the field, how do you choose where you're working so that you can have those best measurable outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges that we always look for, is to make sure from the very beginning. I agree with Ed, his comments, that we look for a population, one that they have to buy into the need for this. Yes. They have to be partners from the very beginning in terms of what the methodology is and the outcome. So we're very careful, because there is a tendency to think of them as our experimental units, yes. Which in one sense they are the experimental units, but if they're in fact bought into what we're trying to do, it's part and parcel of what they see from day one. So for example, our rabies control programs in sub-Saharan Africa, the community is very much bought into that. They actually buy very much into the science and what the challenges are. So I think that's the main thing, is to get the early community engagement for that. And once that happens, I think it goes much more smoothly.
Jerry, how about from Celgene's perspective, as you've moved into these neglected diseases in this work, how has your board responded? Have you had to do some messaging and massaging and educating? And how about the employees?
Okay. Well, first of all, in 2009, when I went to the management of Celgene and told them that I was going to step aside in my current position to create this, I got a unanimous support from the senior leadership. It wasn't because they wanted me to step aside, but they thought this was a wonderful thing. The major reservation I heard was they were afraid that this is such an infectiously wonderful thing that the whole company would want to divert what they were doing to work on this. And so I had to work out a handshake with everyone that I'd first go to the senior managers and say, look, we need your expertise for whatever it is. And then they would tell us who in their division would allow us to move the ball forward. I've also presented to our board of directors on a yearly basis, and I get smiles and pats on the back. They think it's a wonderful idea. Now, I'll just say that the reason why we have made progress, I won't say succeeding, but we've made progress, is that from the very highest level of the company, the CEO and chairman of the board, I am supported. And in fact, he gave me a title, CEO, not because I run the company, but the idea that it's so high that it's very hard for people to say no to me internally. And I've run into instances where a group says, well, we're working on blah, 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 we can't give you and you get a phone call from the person who's the top of the company saying, well, it might be good if you were to help. And that helps grease the wheels. You see the same thing at GlaxoSmithKline. I think without Whitty, both publicly and privately, helping to encourage the employees at Glaxo to worry about global health, they wouldn't be doing anything, or they'd be doing much less. So there has to be support from the top. And I've been very fortunate with two CEOs of Celgene that they've supported what I've been doing. And so we've been able to move the ball forward.
That's terrific. And you do hear that a lot about employee excitement around this, and it builds retention. Yeah. And you wanted to add something?
Well, one other point. I have dozens of requests internally at Celgene for people who want to help us either on a part-time or full-time basis. So it makes people who work for our company feel good about what we're doing.
And that's no small thing at all. Maurizio, you've got sort of the best of all worlds. You've got a lot of funding, and anybody will take your call. How do you choose partnerships, and what do you expect of your partners? What do you want them to bring to the table?
So that's an excellent question, because it may seem, there is a penalty box, so to speak, in working in global health. I can't begin to tell you how many proposals we see that basically associate the global health translation from, let's say, the first world solution to be making something cheap. And the problem in most cases is not to make something cheap. These are some of the fastest growing economies. It is an absolute mistake to think in terms of these countries as failed countries, failed societies, uneconomically attractive countries. The BRIC countries got to be BRICS, and only yesterday they were not BRICS. And mark my word, if you read Gates's annual letter, this year's letter, yes, he predicted that in 20 years we will have no poor countries. Yeah. Okay, so the rate of growth in these economies is staggering, and I am reminded often about what people used to say about China just 20 years ago. I remember a lawyer telling me, don't bother filing patents in China. Okay, that was 20 years ago. Today you wouldn't have a patent portfolio without a very strong Chinese presence. So I'm optimistic about where the economical opportunity that is intrinsic in the growth. So the question then becomes, if it's not making things cheap, what is it? And I think that the key realization is you have to define the problems around the appropriateness of the technology. Trickle down technology, things that work here that trickle down to the base of the economic pyramid, is not enough. And I'll give you a very simple reason why it's not enough. If you take the top 5 killers as diseases in the world, none of the top 5 killers that we experience in this country would be relevant. It's not cardiovascular disease. It's not cancer. It's not any of those. The top 5 are infectious diseases. There are things like diarrheal diseases. There are things like pneumonia. There are HIV/AIDS. There is an overlap. And if you take the combined investment in R&D for the top 5 diseases in, say, the United States, on a global basis, we're spending almost $600 billion in R&D. We're spending $3 billion on the combined 37 top diseases that are killing most people around the world. That is the disconnect that we need to try to fix. So picking your problems and understanding how those problems give you both a challenge, but that challenge as an opportunity is really the critical thing we spend a lot of time thinking about. What moves the needle? What is the translation? Is it a disease that somebody's ignoring? Or is it a medical technology that doesn't need to be made cheap? It needs to be made automated because there are no doctors. There's one pathologist in the country of Zambia serving a population roughly equivalent to the United States. Okay? Having a better clinical infrastructure in Zambia is not going to help me if I don't have a pathologist. So what I need is pathology that works without the doctor. Okay, so those are the picking of the problem that we need to try to arrive to. And it's a tricky business because you don't have market research. You can't call your favorite market researcher and say, tell me the pathology market in Zambia.
Right.
Okay.
But that's an opportunity as well.
It's an opportunity, of course.
And do you get the data, do you get your data from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the University of
Absolutely.
Washington?
And you know, that's a Gates Foundation effort. And it starts with the fact that at this point, almost everything that people are telling you about what's killing people around the world, the data is suspect. I can tell you much of that data is bogus. So we had to start by saying, what are the diseases that are killing people, and what is the true burden? And so at University of Washington, there is this unbelievable effort to try to find the causes of death. And it's the first time that you're getting, I would say, scientifically valid data.
Yep.
Now, they still have huge challenges. They're the first ones to tell you that there is no autopsy data in most of the developing world, so they're using verbal autopsy. They knock on doors and they're saying, we heard somebody died. Did they have a fever? Oh, maybe it's malaria. You know, that's the level of lack of data that exists. So innovation in data and innovation in logistics are critical areas. Sometimes it's not about inventing a new MRI machine. It's figuring out how to make the MRI machine work contextually relevant. And I'll say one last thing. Those of you that have not experienced, say, a place like Africa, you might not realize the logistical issues. Africa is often misdrawn on most maps. Because of projections. When you see it on a map, it's actually understated in size. It's the same effect that makes Greenland look really big. You could put the United States, you could put China, you could put all of Europe, you could put India, and you still would not have filled the landmass of Africa. Now imagine that size with giant populations living with the infrastructure of the Middle Ages. That is the challenge. Getting a vaccine to a remote village in Africa is a huge logistical issue. It's not that we don't have the vaccine, it's getting it there in a way that it can be used. That is the real problem. So those are the challenges and the opportunities in picking the problems.
And I do want to mention, for those of you who are not familiar with the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, that all of their data is open source and they have terrific visualizations. So you just Google global burden of disease, and you can look at any country, you can look by age, by gender, and you can see what the burden of disease and also disability, what's keeping people from working or living a healthy life. So something to consider. So Guy, you understand the issues of culture, what we need to consider. We may have all the technologies. In fact, we're worried that there's a technology pileup in some cases, that we have too many technologies, but we don't have ways either to get them to people or to have people adopt them. Can you talk about that a little bit? What you need to consider, what we all need to consider?
Well, I think the first is to make sure that when you're working with the communities, you do that from the very beginning, and that you're listening to what their priorities are. There's just been a number of times where we've interacted, we've seen programs interacting with some of the local communities. This is mostly in East Africa, but we've seen it also in Central America. and they're really not focusing on the problems that the community sees. So it really starts at that level, in that kind of engagement. The second is to build into what we're doing in terms of what are the outcome metrics that we're seeing, what are the process metrics and outcome metrics, and how those are shared back to the community. I think those are just so that they actually know what's going on in terms of the research. And I think in contrast to what people would think, it's quite easy to engage communities in that. It's really not a challenge. That people are curious the world around, and they're very curious about problems that they see. And one of the challenges with that is we focus a great deal on socio and economic and educational outcomes. We think those are the outcome metrics that are actually most impactful and important. The number of girls that are in school, economic assets of the household, on-farm and off-farm income, those kind of things. Whether they should or not, people in most of the world, including here, don't wake up in the morning thinking about their health as their top priority. They're actually thinking about how they're going to make a living that day, how to get the kids to school. Those things are kind of universal problems, universal priorities. And so we tend to try to work with those priorities, which are often more around economic security, food security, and educational opportunities, all of which, in fact, health feeds into and health is an outcome of.
Right. And we tend to talk about that in terms of thinking about that internationally, but it's so true here as well. If you think about it, all the work that you're trying to do, that you're all working on to improve health, but it's for people to lead a better life, right? It's what John Crowley was talking about, why you're all in this. I want to invite people to come up for questions. You've got a great brain trust here, and so I hope you'll take advantage of them. I have plenty of questions for them, but I'd rather they come from you. Also, I want to invite you all to ask each other questions as well. So, Jerry, I feel like I was in 5th grade here a little bit, but Jerry was just passing a note to Maurizio. Because one of the things we were so excited about on this call when we talked with Jerry, he's working on all this infectious disease work where we have this amazing number of organizations here working on infectious disease, but Jerry, Celgene hadn't been partnered with them yet. So we're kind of a matchmaker even with this panel. So thanks to WBBA. But Jerry, why don't you talk about the opportunities that you see based on what Maurizio and Guy are talking about?
Well, I just want to step back.
That's fine.
For 1 second. The take-home message I take from what Maurizio said is that forget the cost for a second. Think of a new way to approach diseases that affect people who can least afford to live. And the major issue is that poverty is a disease in and of itself. It prevents people from being socially and economically productive. And so I'm going to say this with not feigned humility, but with real humility. We may all end up affecting the diseases that are neglected, but then the question is, how do you get it to the people who could actually benefit? It's the last mile problem. And I think that the good news is that there are mechanisms happening beyond what we're talking here to try to do this. But that's the bigger problem, I think. You have to have both things going on in parallel. But it's very straightforward if you have a group of people who are very bright to create new technologies, to be innovative, which will address these diseases. And I don't know if that really answers your question.
I think that's, well, it's spot on. And again, I want to point out the microphones if people want to come up. But and we do have these organizations like Village Reach working on the last mile, like WSU and the University of Washington thinking about that, and Global Good thinking about how to get these vaccines, keep them in temperature-controlled climates. But what we're hearing more, and Jennifer, I want to ask you about this, that from the beginning of the development of an intervention, you need to be thinking about how it's going to be. Will it be used? Just because you know that there's something, will it be used, and how will it be used? And that's a change, I think, in the way we think about development of these.
Well, and I think the points that have been brought up, Lisa, about that, just that, you know, you have to be flexible and you have to work in the market. We can't transplant our healthcare system to Nigeria or Kenya or Ghana. And just as an example, in Kenya, they have about 5,000 healthcare facilities. They have 20,000 primary schools. So the Minister of Health there, James Macharia, who's just been in his position for about a year now, he's using the primary schools to deliver what they call mass drug administration, so deworming medicines to children through those 20,000 primary schools. And we're talking to him about starting to build on some other diagnostics and treatments onto the platform that his administration has built. And I think that that's absolutely critical. And I think Maurizio and Guy were saying too, you have to work with the structure that the country has. And Kenya is very short of healthcare workers. They don't have enough nurses, they don't have enough physicians, and parents trust the teachers. They trust the teachers more than they trust these different groups coming in to deliver vaccinations, these different groups coming in to deliver bed nets and various treatments. So this system's working very well. It's the Minister of Health in Kenya that's actually implemented this system. And I think that when we go in, we need to build on that system because that's been developed for Kenya by Kenya. So I think that creates a huge opportunity. And so when we think about getting our products to these populations, we need to work with that system and not think that the system is that the products are going to get to patients the same way that they do here.
Mm-hmm. Guy, you were nodding a lot during that.
If I may jump in,
Yes,
I'll share what I call my fish drying story. There was a German company that had developed a technology to dry fish after it's fished. And they decided that a lot of fishermen in the developing world could benefit from it. So as part of a pro bono work, they exported a whole bunch of these fish drying racks to a fishing village in Kenya. And they installed them, they trained the people. The local village was extremely polite to them. And about a year later, they went back to see the impact of this fish drying. And they noticed all the fish were still drying on the beach. And the fish drying racks were empty or used for other type of things. And they asked the elders why they weren't using it, and the answer was that they sell the fish based on weight. And therefore, if it was too well dried, it was a loss of economic value, which meant the whole technology was irrelevant for them. It was not a problem that needed a solution. But it was a technology that was effectively crammed down. You want to avoid the fish racks.
Yes, yeah, avoid the fish racks. So go ahead, guys.
There's going to be a question there in a minute, but I just one point before that is we're very interested in early adopters of technology. So who's adopted this? And the second, and if there's no early adopters, that's telling you something right away. But the second is why adopters. So part of the work we do in Western Kenya, part of the socioeconomic work we do is we ask a very specific question. When we look at about 6,000 households, which is, did you sleep under a bed net last night? It's not the same question as, do you have a bed net? It's, did you sleep under one last night? And the uptake is not what you would think. They may have a bed net, but then why do certain people sleep under it and not? And we can actually map it to both education and economic assets within the household. So it's both early adopters and then finding out why adopters. It's a really important part of any implementation.
I'll say that, we're in the process of setting up a leprosy trial, an E&L trial for a drug that's not a teratogen, and you have to go where leprosy is. So there's a lot of leprosy in Nepal, and so we sent, and it turns out there is a unit in a major hospital in Kathmandu that does treat leprosy, and they're willing to work with us. So we sent them a protocol to treat this E&L, and they got back to us and said, well, this is not the way we practice medicine in Nepal. And so after a nice teleconference with them, we said, well, why don't you write the protocol based on the way you practice medicine, and then we will amend it based on the properties of our drug. And I think this will go forward. I think next year we will be treating people in Nepal to see if our drug works.
That's great. We have a question out here.
Regarding bed nets again, I think a major advance has been pyrethroid impregnated bed net that kills mosquitoes. And so there's now been some spread of pyrethroid resistance in various parts of the world. So do you see a way of replacing with the new generation the pyrethroid class of insecticides?
Yeah.
Shall
Go
I take
ahead,
it?
Maurizio, and then...
So,
Another case of where industry wants to make a profit, and that's not always.
Yeah. So the the diseases that are directly relevant to vector, specifically mosquitoes, do very much rank in that top 10 or top 5 list that I talked about, namely malaria. And so this is a huge health emergency around the world. Now, for those of you that have been tracking the news coming out of other states, you may have recently, literally within the last 3 weeks, noticed that there are untreatable outbreaks of strange tropical diseases in places like Florida and Tennessee and Louisiana. And if you were to ask the vector control folks at the CDC, what's the situation with vectors such as mosquitoes, they'll tell you the mosquitoes are coming. Because effectively what's happening is they're evolving beyond they're developing resistance to insecticides. And they have a very fast cycle of about 30 days, and so the evolution happens fairly quickly. So the sad truth is the techniques that we use to eradicate malaria in this country and in Europe and so on, you could not use them today and have the same efficacy.
Right.
So this is a health emergency, and it's not just for the developing world.
Right.
So we are, for example, very keenly looking at non-insecticide-based vector control forms. And you probably don't, when you're saying non-insecticide based, you probably don't want to ask the insecticide companies to do that innovation. Yeah. Okay, so it's changing the ecosystem. Those of you that are fans of Google's, you'll probably find some very advanced ideas that came out of our lab, for example, including the use of technology that was borrowed from the military and Star Wars to kill mosquitoes with lasers. And you can say, well, okay, that sounds really crazy, but it's not so crazy when you actually look at what can be done. And so I'm not suggesting lasers is the fix for this problem, but I'm saying there is a lot of innovation in this area, and there are a lot of techniques that hinge on vector control to lead to the end game of malaria eradication. So it's an area of active investment. I can't tell you there are great solutions, but it's an area of active investment.
And Guy, I know that this, the antimicrobial resistance is a huge issue that you're looking at, and more broadly, since most infectious diseases are animal-borne in one way or another.
Well, we look at antimicrobial resistance.
Lean forward just a little bit.
Yeah, we look at antimicrobial resistance really from two aspects. And the first is it's a great definition of the importance of global health, because there's no such thing as a local solution to antibiotic resistance. People are often amazed. They'll say, well, I've never taken an antibiotic in my life. It doesn't make any difference. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria are transmitted through the food. What happens in Mumbai tomorrow will be in Seattle, could be in Harborview by Sunday. There's just a complete transmission pathway. I think, unfortunately, there's been a lot of attention has been about reducing the use of antibiotics in people. Therefore, when your 3-year-old's screaming with an ear infection, you're not supposed to do anything. I think that's fairly unlikely. Antibiotics are to be used, for human health. So how do we then extend the life of antibiotics? Well, I think we do it 3 ways. Obviously, discovery of new antibiotic classes. There's been a lot of attention paid to that. And actually, a very recent article in Science kind of pointed out that actually once they get to phase 2 and phase 3 trials, new antibiotics actually have a higher success rate than almost all other drugs. But I think there's, in terms of curiosity, there's 2 other venues. So if we think about how you pick up antibiotic-resistant bacteria from the environment, and that's a shared environment with animals, with other humans, it has to do with sanitation. We can begin to think, well, there's reservoirs for antimicrobial resistance in the environment, and there's transmission pathways. So how do we now look at attacking those? So a perfect solution would be you've had a course of antibiotic treatment, and then at the end, if you will, there's a chaser where you take another drug that basically restores the fitness cost of carrying antimicrobial resistance to the bacteria, so that in fact, as you leave the hospital, you also no longer carry the antibiotic-resistant bacteria with you. So I think that's an example of something that requires global thinking, but also there's tremendous room for innovation beyond new classes of antibiotics in how we preserve the efficacy of our current antibiotics.
And I think it would really be helpful if you could make that chaser taste like beer or something like that. So I'm not sure who was, okay, you're in? Okay, great. Oh, wait, just go over to the mics because we've got some other questions here. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to ask specific questions about our technology. We came up with an instrument that allows you to diagnose autism at the age of 0. So we are very interested to find out how relevant it is to the developing world and what would be the qualification for such an instrument to be accepted, so we avoid drying fish wrecks like you mentioned before. And I would like to ask each one of you if you could contribute to this kind of understanding, so we want to gain.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's go down. Jerry, why don't we just start maybe, and we'll make it quick because now we have a number of questioners.
The United States used to invite the ministers of health of Africa to come on a yearly basis to liaise with people in the government, but also people in the industry. And I talked to a person in the Ministry of Health of Nigeria who said, well, now that our population is living older, we're now really having to deal with autism and schizophrenia and other mental health diseases. I'll just say that disease-adjusted life years, or DALYs, the number 2 in the world is depression, by the way. Yeah. So it is very relevant. So then it becomes a question of how good is this technology and can it be leveraged so in a lower middle-income setting or low-income setting it can be used to identify people. The trouble with all these diseases that we deal with in a high-income setting is that they're very expensive. These are chronic diseases that you treat for a whole lifetime. Yeah. And that's also an issue.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on that? All right, I think we're good. Yes, sir.
So one of the things that got mentioned was that an organization in a website I admire, like the IHME, and in talking about the patterns of global disease burden. I mean, obviously there's a lot of disparities around the world in what diseases are in places, but I thought maybe the argument could be overdrawn, so I thought I'd look on the site, and of course I only have my phone here, so I couldn't check everything, but I looked at mortality, and one of the things we were talking about in like 1990, the top diseases were infectious diseases, but if you look at what IHME is saying for 2010, the number 1 disease for mortality in the world is now ischemic heart disease. And all of the infectious diseases over that period of time, except for AIDS, have gone down. There's 2 diseases in the top 5 now that are cardiovascular diseases. And so, and also during that period of time, I think there's a good argument that disparities in access to health in the industrialized world in many cases has increased. So in some sense, the world is flattening in terms of health access in some respects. So while there are important differences, one of the problems that we see perhaps in misinvestment or misalignment of investment in healthcare research may be self-correcting in the sense that we're increasingly resembling the places in the world that we see as poorest and least like us, and they're increasingly resembling us. For example, there's more diabetics in India than there are in the United States now.
Right. I'll mention one program that we're involved with real briefly that's called Global to Local, where we're using what we've learned in the global health in the developing world to apply them to the developed world. We actually have a pilot project in South King County. So we're looking at technology. We're looking at community health workers, technology, mobilization, and community-based organizations to address those. And there are those, I think what Maurizio was talking about, if you break some of those numbers down, if you look at it collectively, I know that that's what it shows on the IHME on that as well. And I think how you define cardiovascular would be where you have technology intervention and where it's lifestyle and choices in nutrition and things like that.
Yeah,
so,
may I comment on that? You're absolutely right that the world is flattening. Okay, so it's an important consideration. Where are we going to be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? Remember what I told you about the methodology surrounding some of this data? So be careful about the data that you read. I'm not questioning Chris Murray's work there at all, but I'm just saying there are a lot of assumptions that go into building those data, and there's a lot of sources of data that you could interpret and derive conclusions on what's relevant. So each organization will make their own assessment, and you'll use the best data available. But there's no question infective diseases will hopefully be eradicated or brought at least under control, and then all the other diseases will become relevant. So by any means, I'm not suggesting that infectious diseases is the only focus of global health policy. However, you know, the point I was trying to make is be really careful about the relevancy of the trickle down. So it's not just about making stuff that works here cheap. I think that's the takeaway I wanted you to have.
Ed, you had a comment.
Well, I think certainly
in
the the issue with dueling data, right, is that it is about relevancy. And when you look at, as you engage with the partnership, whether it's a nonprofit like Maurizio's or a corporate like Sue's, is the fundamental basis of what you define is the acute unmet customer need. That's this last 10 minutes of conversation is all about that. And so it'll be a combination of data. So you heard Sue, she's focused on brain. You could argue is not anywhere in that data set, but they're investing. And so at that point in the conversation, it's all about the brain and brain health. And it's about, well, what is it that you're going to do? Is it taking existing therapies to them in a remote setting, or finding a new alternative diagnostic therapy that's disruptive? And it's up to you to kind of decide what the solution is to that acute unmet need. And that's the one thing I think we have to be really vigilant about, that definition, because that's how funders think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Jerry,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah, I refer you to the UN website. My guess is that probably the majority of people don't know about Millennium Development Goals, which were started in year 2000, partially driven by Bill Gates. But these were 15 things that the world had to achieve. About half of them are disease-related, and by 2015, next year, probably a little over half of them will be met. But they did overlook the non-communicable diseases. And so 2 years ago, the UN passed a resolution giving industry and others till 2026 to approach 4 non-communicable diseases. I'm disappointed because I left out psychiatric, but by 2026 for low and low middle income settings, and that is arteriosclerotic coronary heart disease, COPD, metabolic disorders, including diabetes and obesity, and cancer, which are increasingly important. So by their estimate, and again, numbers, these are not good numbers, but they're the only numbers we have, 60 million people will die this year, of which 60% will die of an NCD. So I refer you to look at the UN as well.
Go ahead.
I'm just, one brief comment. I'm on a one-man crusade to not use the term non-communicable diseases, because in fact they're extremely communicable. They're communicable through the family, through a community, through an environment. Heart disease, diabetes, all of these in fact relate back to the environment, to architecture, the built architecture.
Yeah.
Public spaces, educational systems. I'm probably going to lose this battle in trying to get rid of the term non-communicable diseases, but in fact, they're just as communicable as infectious diseases, just in another manner. And I think if we're going to look at solutions, both short-term and long-term, we're going to have to build in how we change and improve behaviors, how we learn about behaviors in a scientific way. And that can be for uptake of a drug to treat an infectious disease. It can be impregnated bed nets, but it also will extend to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, preventable cancers, HPV vaccines, et cetera. I think we have to look at these in a broad context, and so please join me in my crusade to get rid of the term non-communicable diseases.
Can we take the pledge? Can everybody take the pledge now? All right, great, excellent. We've got at least 3, Guy, and I'll join you too, so we'll have 4. We're running out of time, so I apologize to everybody, but I think you were next, and then we'll go to Monty.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Florin. I'm with Arbutus Medical, and we have a low-cost surgical device that surgeons have come to us with cash offers to buy in the developing world. It's an affordable, safe, orthopedic drill alternative. I'm wondering, you've talked a bit about funding, and what's your advice to a startup like us who's not yet on the radar of Gates and is also approaching traditional funders who are maybe afraid of the market, or not afraid, but uncertain, and what we're doing seems crazy, even though our projections seem quite favorable, and people are crazy to buy this device from the data that we have so far. What's your advice to our startup, basically?
Can you do that in 30 seconds and maybe talk afterwards, Maurizio? I know you have a plane to catch.
Yeah, see me afterwards.
There you go. Okay. The best 3 words you could possibly hear. Monty, wrap us up.
So, great conversation. It really has me thinking about the bridges that need to be built between commercial, nonprofit, academic, and government organizations to really speed up socially and financially positive progress. And one of the questions that kind of pops into my mind is how much of an impediment is this attitude that sometimes pops up in nonprofit government organizations that's sort of anti-profit, that somehow profit is evil. Do you see that in your work, and what can we do to sort of educate the nonprofit sector about the benefits of profit to scale? And I say that as a somebody that works for a nonprofit organization.
Who wants to say something?
It's coming.
I was actually going to ask Guy.
Okay.
But we can.
Well, I can probably give a 30-second answer to that as well. When we see uptake of technologies in the families we're working with, which are all less than $2 per day, we see those that are most successful are those that improve their economics, so their household economics. So I think having a profit motive in there all the way down that supply chain to the end user is absolutely required. So I don't think there's any reticence from an academic viewpoint of doing that. As I said, we like to build scholarship into that, and that's just learn through that where the weak points in that chain are, how to strengthen them, how we learn from them. But as far as there being a profit motive, we think that's probably absolutely required to have actually an implementation pathway at all.
Jennifer, yes, why don't you?
So, yeah, I agree with Guy. I think I frankly, I come from industry, and I think people should make money. I think that's the only thing that's going to build a really, truly sustainable long-term program that will be successful and won't depend on donor funding. So, I think the key is innovative new financing models and bringing more partners into funding and supporting global health products. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that with bringing in the big oil companies like Chevron, Anadarko, many others in Africa. But it's really thinking creatively about these funding models. The Milken Institute and some other academics have looked at these health impact bonds in developing countries. I think there's so much opportunity to explore innovative financing models where people do make money, that make and sell the products. And I'm not always the biggest fan of just completely philanthropic donated products. I don't necessarily think it's as sustainable.
Yeah, it's too risky. And for those of you who, I think there's a much more of a push by funders to go for a more sustainable model now. So USAID is just launching their new innovation division. I was just looking at that yesterday, where they're seeding opportunities for partnerships like this, and it shouldn't be nonprofit. And I think there's been a real shift in the trend over the past, I would say, 6 years or so, that people are understanding that this is the way to move forward. We are out of time. I think what all of us, if you all don't mind my speaking for you to some degree, we want you to see the opportunity here. I hope, because we need that curiosity that Guy was talking about, that passion that Maurizio and Jerry and Ed all have. There are opportunities. We have a terrific center of expertise here in Washington State that can be drawn on. It's very collaborative, and the global health community is very interested in sharing their learnings and learning about what you're up to. So I want to remind everybody before we adjourn to join next door for the Women to Watch Awards ceremony. And can we please thank our panel and WBBA.